Now I would like to introduce two important representatives from OPWDD. Patricia Downs, OPWDD Director
Patricia
of
Down. How?
and Cindy Small-Kakula, statewide coordinator of Certified Residential Opportunities, known as CRO program. Patricia?
Thank you, Dr. Bay. We appreciate this opportunity to share information about the OPWDD housing programs with the people in your community who are interested in understanding more about our programs and how they and their family members can access information and also services. My name is Patricia Downs. I am the Director of Housing Programs here at OPWDD. I am here today with my colleague, Cindy Small-Kakula. I will be doing most of the presentation today, and Cindy will be doing a large portion of the second presentation in a couple of weeks. Today is the first of two presentations that we're making. Today's session is going to mostly focus on what we call non-certified housing options. And then we'll go over, just so people have an idea, what will be covered in the second session in 2 weeks, so that you get an idea of what we're looking at that point. Today, under non-certified housing options and funding, we're going to talk about the types of housing that is available to people with developmental disabilities, how to create and access shared living opportunities for folks with developmental disabilities, the general process for planning for a change in housing, and also we'll talk about the OPWDD
像
housing.
OPWDD 住房补贴和过渡的这个津贴，我们会讲讲计划改变住房等。
지금을 어떻게 받는지, 또 지역사회에 어떻게 할 수 있는지에 대해서 이야기하겠습니다. 다음에는 6월 30일 지금부터 2주 후에 있을 건데요. 그때는 오늘 이야기한 것에 대해서 잠깐 복습하고, 그리고 저희들이 어떻게 가용주택을 찾을 수 있느냐에 대해서 이야기하겠습니다. 그 이후에 신드가 더 많은 서포트 필요한 사람들이 인증 중
and whether or not they're eligible for those services. Okay, why we need to talk about housing options for folks is because people really are looking for opportunities in a variety of different settings in the community to live. You know, when I'm looking for housing, I want to have some options. I have different life goals at different points in my life. So I'm looking for different types of housing when I'm younger, as I age. You know, and the same thing happens for our friends and family and loved ones with developmental disabilities. At different points in their life, they're looking for different types of housing. So we have a continuum of options for folks to access housing and supports throughout their life based on what they're looking for at that particular time. So we're going to talk about that today. So now we're going to move to slide number 6. And I will try to remember to let everyone know what slide I'm on so we can follow along. In order to understand the housing options, you know, OPWDD has its own language, basically, that we use. And there are 2 broad categories of types of housing that a person can receive funding and services through. One is non-certified housing, and that is where the person controls their housing and their services, and a provider typically does not control any portion of that. Non-certified housing is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's really individualized. You know, we're really looking for what is best for the person at that time. And it's also based on what a person can afford. Many of the people on this call today are probably located in the downstate area of New York State, where housing is extremely expensive. We do understand that. So sometimes decisions are made for a person finding housing, similar to if I'm looking for housing, you know, the cost of housing and how much I can afford is part of the whole calculation. So that is something that is considered as well. We'll talk about that as we move through today. But these are, you know, really non-certified is living in the community in a non-provider controlled setting where the person has control over their housing and who they live with and where they live. Certified housing is what Cindy will be talking about at the next session. And really, it's the process that we use at OPWDD to help people access residential services if they have a higher level of need for supports. For example, having staff around them all the time. The assessment is completed through a process that Cindy will cover. And certified housing, the major differentiation of certified housing versus non-certified housing is that under certified housing, which is sometimes called licensed housing, the residential provider agency offers higher levels of oversight and support, and they control the setting. OPWDD is an oversight agency of these types of settings, this type of housing. Has a lot more control and oversight. We go in to make sure that certain things are happening. There's a lot more rules and expectations of that type of housing. So Cindy will talk about that more in 2 weeks at our next session. But these are the two broad types of housing that we discuss here at OPWDD. Okay, we're moving to slide number 7. In non-certified housing, people with disabilities have the same housing choices as people without disabilities. As I mentioned, when I look for housing, what I looked for when I was in my 20s is different now that I'm older. What I need, if I need accessible housing, it changes. What I'm looking for changes. I might move to a different area of the state, and that changes my housing expectations and needs. There's a lot of different things that happen. In non-certified housing, the person is at the center of the choice of their housing. You can see from this slide, there's a lot of different options. A person can rent an apartment by themselves. They can rent an apartment with someone else and share their housing. They can buy a home in some instances. They can live with their family in some instances. They might buy a condo or some other type of apartment, or they might rent a room in someone else's home. It's important to note that not every one of these options will be funded through OPWDD, and we'll go through some of the restrictions as we move through this presentation today. But for example, renting a room in someone else's home is not something that OPWDD will fund. And so we don't want someone to be confused about that. So, that is one of the items that won't be funded through the OPWDD housing subsidy, but many of the other opportunities will. We're now on slide 8. Why is community housing options and choices important? People with developmental disabilities, much like people without developmental disabilities, are interested in having options and choices, and things change throughout your life. So community housing options are focused on to ensure that we can help someone realize their dreams and goals. That's always something that we're looking for throughout the OPWDD service system, wherever possible, to support an individualized goal. We want people to be included in their community, have opportunities to access their community. We don't want people to feel isolated. We don't want people to have a hard time getting to services that they need, to buy groceries, to do things like that. We also have public policy mandates that we need to keep in mind. The federal government has certain expectations regarding how our funding works, because we do have a lot of funding that comes from the federal government here in New York State. So we need to be sure that we follow those rules. We also have some of our own rules here in New York State that we also need to follow. So we try and make things as clear as possible, but the underlying part of the process that everyone needs to be aware of is that there are rules that we need to meet based on where money is coming from. So we always just need to keep that in the back of our minds, that there are certain mandates that come with some of the funding. non-certified opportunities are important because they help to alleviate some of the pressures of higher cost resources. For example, if someone does not need 24 hours of supports and services and can be supported in the community, that is typically a less expensive opportunity to provide appropriate supports for someone. And that allows us to support more people with the same limited amount of money. But most importantly, non-certified options give opportunities to people and give choice to people, which is incredibly important in our service system. Okay, we are now on slide 9. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of choices of places that people can live, but not all of them will receive OPWDD funding or be eligible for OPWDD funding. And sometimes the situation is it could go either way. And in that situation, you want to talk to your person's care manager or speak to your care manager if you're receiving services through OPWDD, or contact the regional office and we can help figure out whether or not your proposed situation is fundable or not. But broad brush strokes here is kind of how most of the more common housing arrangements, whether or not they're fundable or not. The first choice is always, own your own home, or if your family owns a home, this may or may not qualify for an OPWDD housing subsidy, depending on the tenancy right.
그 사람이 갖고 있는 테넌트 그 세입자라든지 그런 걸로 해서 받을 수도 있고 받지 않을 수도 없습니다. 그래서 우리가 그 상황을 봐야 합니다. 왜냐하면 그 사람이 리스에 이름이 있는지 DD에 집 문서에 이름이 있는지 그런 것들을 저희가 봐야 합니다. 그래서 그 사람이 그게 어떤 상황이냐에 따라서 보조금을 받을 수도 있고 받을 수도 없습니다. 만약에 누가 다른 사람 집에 방을 임대를 한다면 그것은 주택 보조금을 받을 자격이 없습니다. 방을 임대를 할 때는 그 사람한테 그 집 전체에 권리가 없기 때문에 그냥 방 하나를 임대하는 경우는 우리가 하우징 주택을 통해서 보조금 받을 수가 없습니다. 그렇지만 만약에 혼자서 아파트를 렌트하거나 룸메이트와 렌트하는 경우는 그런 경우는 보통은 저희가 OPWDD를 통해서 재정 지원을 받을 수 있고 어떤 경우는 다른 재정 지원 하우징 초이스 바우처라든지 우리가 알고 있는 섹션 A라고 부르는 것을 받을 수 있습니다.
A 这是我们经常看见的一个选项。总的来说，就是假设所有的其他的条件都满足的话，通常这个合租或者自己
Sometimes people buy their own home, a townhouse, condominium, mobile home, whatever type of dwelling that is. And again, it is possible that could be funded similar to the first item, but it depends on what the exact situation is, and the person has to have tenancy rights or legal rights to the housing unit. So you can see that there are a lot of different options, but depending on how the person has access to that particular option could determine whether or not OPWDD can offer a housing subsidy in that situation. Okay, we are now on slide 10. How does someone access services in general and OPWDD housing services specifically? A person seeking services from OPWDD must request the services through the regional field office. I just want to point out that this is a slight change in language, and I don't want everyone to be confused. Historically, we have referred to the local office as the DDRO, Developmental Disabilities Regional Office. We are now
개인 지역 사무실이라고 했는데 지금은 우리가 단어를 바꿔서 지역 현장 사무소 RFO라고 바뀌었습니다. 오늘 하는 세션과 다음 2주 후에 있는 것은 OPWDD 지역 사무실이라고 하는 것은 리지널 지역 현장 사무소를 합니다. 보통 사람 경우는 케어 매니저가 있습니다. 그래서 서비스를 받고 꼭 케어 매니저를 있어야 합니다. 경우에 따라서는 웨이버 서비스가 없는 경우에는 메디케이드를 통해서 그런 경우는 케어 매니저가 없을 수도 있습니다. 그런 경우에는 지역 현장 사무소에 연락을 하면 그들이 주택 서비스를 받을 수 있도록 해드리겠습니다. 서비스는 개인의 필요와 주거 형태와 보는 사람들의 필요의 정도에 따라서 또 그 현지 고려 사항을 따라서 사람이 최대 임대 보조금을 주 카운티별로 또 우리가 HUD
fair market rent number that they issue every year. So it is a number established by HUD, and it often will not cover full market rates. FMR is fair market rent, which is a different number. It's usually lower than, especially in the downstate area, than many typical housing opportunities. So that is something that you need to be aware of as you're going through a planning process for someone to have their own housing, for someone with a developmental disability to access housing and access a housing subsidy. So you do need to plan well ahead of time and be aware that there is a maximum amount of money that will be made available, and that may impact the choices that a person has for housing. Okay, now we're going to speak a little bit about shared living. Very often people receiving the OPWDD services, especially the housing subsidy, want to live in the community and they want to live with other people. It is pretty common that everyone likes to have people around them, at least sometimes. So very often our folks are looking for housing arrangements with a friend of theirs or sometimes a family member. Sometimes they may have paid staff living with them. And so there are a number of different options from that perspective as well. We're on page 12, slide 12. When we're talking about housing subsidies, usually we're also discussing the services that people need to live independently in the community as well. Most of the services that people receive are funded through Medicaid through the waiver. You'll hear waiver a lot. When you speak to people about OPWDD services, that is how we access federal funding for long-term supports and services for people. In non-certified settings, there's a number of different waiver services that are available to folks to help them live independently in the community. A very popular option is self-directed services. That is a funding mechanism where people have a lot more control over what types of services they receive and hiring their own staff if they're able to. And, you know, it offers a few other more flexible options for people to plan their own services and have options in their lives. So that is a very popular option that many people are selecting. Under that program, you can hire a live-in caregiver or a paid neighbor. We're going to talk about that more in depth in the next few slides, but those are only available under self-directed services. Community habilitation is very common. It is the funding stream for services, habilitative services for people who are just generally in the community doing activities, supporting people in their homes, supporting people who have hobbies, who may need assistance in learning how to navigate their community, maybe grocery shopping, cooking, things like that. So that is another option that is available. And again, that's community habilitation. Under the waiver as well, there's something called environmental modifications. And this is a service where changes can be made to a person's home to make it more accessible for them and to allow them to live in a community setting. What we often see requests in environmental modifications are things like ramps for people to be able to get into their home, changes to the bathroom, roll-in showers perhaps, or grab bars in bathrooms, things like that. So that is an option that's available as well. If you need these, if you or a person who lives with you needs these supports, they're called environmental modifications, and you can speak to your care manager or your loved one's care manager to see if you're able to access these services and how to go about doing that. One of the other funding opportunities that we have that a lot of people may or may not be aware of are assistive technologies. And assistive technologies are also funded through Medicaid, and they are available to help someone live independently in the community, to prevent the need for someone to have staff on site all the time, to give people a little bit more independence. What you usually see in the way of assistive technologies are things like med administration machines, like where someone's pills are counted out and issued in the morning when they need to take them. It might send a reminder to their phone to remind them to take their meds. Assistive technologies can also be things like wheelchairs, canes, different things like that to help with ambulation. There are a number of different items that fall under assistive technology, but that is always something that folks should be aware are available, and look into and see if that is something that would work for yourself or your loved one, depending on what you need and what is needed in that situation. But we really are focusing on having a lot of options available to help support people to live more independently and to allow them to age in place, stay with their families, things along those lines. So those are available. Even community hab, environmental modifications, and assistive technologies are available for people who are living with their families, even if they're not eligible for a housing subsidy. Those are generally available services independently of the housing subsidy. Okay, we're now on page 13. We're going to talk a little bit about shared living. This is really something that a lot of people are interested in. Again, people often don't like living alone. It can be lonely and isolating to live alone, depending on how you feel about living alone. So this is always, these types of activities and this type of planning is good to help identify if it's appropriate for someone to be living with another person, and how the other person living with someone with the developmental disabilities can help them and can, just basically make a person feel better, safer, happier in their housing arrangement. Shared living is an approach. It's not a model. It's just how you look at things and how you plan for things. You'll hear us talk a lot about a person-centered planning process, and that's a very specific set of language that we use. What it really means is you talk to the person, you figure out what's best for the person with their input on what they want in life, what their goals are, what their ambitions are, and then you develop a service or a housing arrangement or whatever the situation is based on their specific needs. Instead of creating a model and trying to make people fit into the model, we are trying to create an approach in which you're looking at what the person wants and trying to fit what's available to support the person in their life. In shared living, the person has the control over the housing, and that's a major difference. There are a lot of situations where the person is living with their family and the family has legal rights to the
房子是家里人的，法律上是
권리가 있다든지 아니면 인증주택일 경우에 그 제공자가 그 집에 대해서 그런 모든 것을 법적인 권리가 있습니다. 그래서 OPWDD가 하는 쉐어링 것은 사람들이 자기 집에 권리가 있습니다. 그래서 자기가 집에 그 집에 필요한 보조라든지 다른 것을 가지고 들어옵니다. 그래서 반대가 아니라요. 이런 경우에는 보통 이제 룸메이트하고 사는데요. 그래서 그게 이제 외떨어지지 않고 또 뭐 음식하는 것도 그렇고 모든 집안일을 서로 나눠서 하는 건데요.
Find out for a week kind of thing. So, very often, that's something important to folks, and you want to, in many situations, some housemaid who can be paid staff or not lives with someone so that they have some more supports around them. Okay. The benefits of shared living, in addition to, really supporting the person and making them feel more comfortable, alleviating loneliness, alleviating isolation, things like that. If you're sharing the costs of an apartment, your resources go further, right? You are also in a situation often where you can share staff if both roommates are receiving services through OPWDD. They can share one ComHab worker in some instances who might come in and help the people in the apartment learn how to cook, maybe go grocery shopping with them, maybe do some supports to help both people learn how to navigate their community, use public transportation, things along those lines. So it can often be very beneficial to people who share their housing because they can often share staffing depending on what the situation is. So that's always a good option. If it's important and a person needs more staffing, sharing resources can sometimes increase the amount of staffing that can be available. Again, because the cost of having one staff with two people sharing the staff is lower than having one staff per person. So sometimes instead of 4 hours a day, you might be able to afford through a self-directed plan twice as many hours a day if that's something that is needed. It gives a lot more flexibility in how you use your funding and how far your funding can go if you need that level of support. Okay, we are now on slide 15. A lot of people who are self-directing, I did mention that there are some service options that are only available if a person is self-directing, and one of them is the live-in caregiver arrangement. This is where the person receiving services who's OPWDD eligible owns or leases the housing unit, whether it's an apartment or a house or whatever the housing unit is, the person controls that setting. Then if they have identified a live-in caregiver, then the funding for the live-in caregiver's rent, food, and utilities is taken out of the budget. And basically the live-in caregiver is paid by not having to pay room and board at the housing location. And, the person, the live-in caregiver will live with a person. They're there in the evenings and overnight typically. They might be available in the morning to help someone get ready for their day, but they're really there to have a roommate, basically, someone there. So if there is an emergency, someone can call for help. Just someone there in case there's support needed overnight occasionally, things like that. So it's really, the live-in caregiver is designed so that there is someone living with the person receiving services. But the person receiving services controls the setting. And if they decide that, for whatever reason, they're not happy with their live-in caregiver or the live-in caregiver leaves, the person can select another live-in caregiver or opt not to have that roommate moving forward, whatever the situation is. Live-in caregivers can also provide community rehabilitation under certain circumstances. If their supports of a person go beyond, just being around and helping out, like, we might with a roommate, if you're not OPWDD eligible. Sometimes we help each other. Your roommate might be around, they might know to call. If you're really sick, but don't need to go to the hospital, they might know to call your family and say, Trisha's sick today, you might want to bring her some soup or something, this kind of thing. It's that level of support is normally expected, but if a higher level of support is needed, for example, if, the person helps with toileting in the middle of the night or something like that, and that, that might be eligible for a separate payment to the living caregiver under community habilitation. So you have to be careful on how you design these services, but that is also an option that could be available for someone. Okay, another option, which sometimes people avail themselves under the self-direction program, is paid neighbor. And this is really a situation where, someone lives near the person receiving services, maybe in an apartment building, they live down the hall, something like that. And they receive a stipend to generally be available to provide supports as needed. Really, the paid neighbor, the goal of having a paid neighbor is to have someone around for general wellness and independence. If there's an emergency, they know who to contact, things like that. We all have friends and family around us in the neighborhood. And if someone, it's always good to have someone around in case something were to happen to you. I'm very good friends with my neighbor. If something were to happen to me, she knows how to reach my family who don't live with me and let them know that there's a problem, things along those lines. And it's kind of that arrangement. It's just someone who checks in on you occasionally to make sure you're okay, see if you need anything. Maybe you go to the store with them when they go and buy their groceries, things along those lines. So as you can see, there are a lot of different options and opportunities to provide services and to provide supports for folks through our different funding mechanisms so that they can live in the community. But as with everything, it's really in the details, whether or not it's covered, whether someone can be paid to do it or not, whether or not OPWDD will fund it. So obviously, a lot of planning is required to do that. So now that you have an idea of what might be available, we're just going to talk about some basic activities around the planning process so you get a flavor for what this does. The planning process is typically not quick. I'm going to be very honest about it. You want to make sure that you have everything in a row as you're planning to help someone move into an independent setting. But it's very, it promotes a lot of independence and a lot of, personal growth and
혼자도 굉장히 사람도 나 자신도 굉장히 많이 성장해야 되고 나의 행복이란
but the end results can be fabulous. So, this is really something that families should be ready for if they're going to support someone moving into a new setting, or, if they change settings, if someone is living in an apartment and they want to move somewhere else, there's a whole process. Like there is, if any of us move, any folks without developmental disabilities move into a new setting, you have to plan to find an apartment, you have to plan to pay for the apartment, do all these things, move all your belongings, things like that. So it's a long process, but it's important, and the outcome can be really, really rewarding for everyone involved, and especially for the person who is looking for the housing and to have more independence. Okay, we're on slide 18. Some of the things to look at and explore when planning for a housing change. First of all, what is the person looking for? We all do it too. If we're deciding we're going to move, do we want to move closer to where we work? Do we want to move closer to family? If we're finding an apartment, how far away do we want to live from family? What are our strengths? Do we need, are we able to drive or are we not able to drive? Do we need public transportation? Things like that. Do I want to be near a lot of activities in the community, or do I prefer to live out, in a little bit more suburban area, so it's quieter and I can walk to the park, or whatever the situation is. So, these are the kinds of things, this is the first line of conversation around housing is what are you looking for and what do you hope to achieve? Do you want to live with someone else or do you want to live alone? Do you want to live near your family or do you not? One of the other things to take into account are natural supports that people have and who can help with the whole process. Are there any, we call them people who are in the circle of support for a person receiving services. You'll see this a lot in self-direction because that is part of the whole planning process for self-direction, but it's true even for people who are not specifically self-directing. You have people around you who help to support you in your life. People who you bounce ideas off of, I was thinking of maybe moving into, this area of the city. What do you think about that? Well, that would be great, but it's kind of far away. People may not visit you that often, things like that. But, you kind of identify people who can help with the planning process, who can help find apartments with you, who can kind of keep focused on what the goal is, different things like that. So you're identifying not only big picture what a person wants, but who's there to help them get there. And again, who does the person want to live with? Someone may be willing to live alone or happy to live alone as long as friends and family are close by. But maybe if they're moving a little further away, or if, for example, if, someone is going to live in the community and their parents maybe are going to start going to the south for the winter time for 2 or 3 months, that might be something to consider on, well, maybe a roommate would be good because sometimes the parents may not be there to help with any activities that are going on or any challenges that they may encounter. So you really, that is a consideration. You want to plan for who a person lives with. You need to figure out how to identify appropriate roommates. Even if your loved one has a really good friend and they're thinking we can live together and this will be great, you want to make sure, maybe do a test run to make sure that people get along when they've been together for a long time. I always joke that personally I live alone. And when I have people come visit me after 3 or 4 days, I'm like, okay, when are you leaving? Right. So, these are things that need to be explored. Can people live together? Are they able to get a large enough apartment? Sometimes it's fine to live with someone else as long as you have 2 bedrooms or, there's enough room that, you can have some privacy if you want privacy. In some areas of the state, that's hard to achieve because sometimes it's really expensive. Sometimes you have to share a room. In New York City specifically, the rent can be very high. So, sometimes you may need to share a room. Obviously, if you're going to share a room by choice, then you need to know that you're going to be okay living together, having that type of close quarters. And of course, financially, you have to assess what resources a person has each month to be able to put food on the table, to make sure that they can pay their share of the rent, to make sure that there's a rental subsidy available if that's an appropriate arrangement. And sometimes the rental subsidy from OPWDD is not sufficient to pay the entire rent. So there may be an additional cost above what OPWDD is able to provide. So, it's a long process. There are a number of items that need to be considered when you're making the plan. And, anyone who has moved or, moved between apartments or moved out of their family's home to live independently themselves is aware of all of these different options and questions and items that you need to consider. So same type of thing when you're working with your loved one, or if you yourself are receiving OPWDD services and you're looking to move, these are the things you need to consider and talk about and really determine what's best for you or, what's best for your loved one. But you really need to have the person who is going to move be involved in the conversation and not really assume that you know best for this person, because once they move, there's a lot more independence and you may not, if you're a parent who's used to having your child living with you, and suddenly they're living somewhere else, you may not always be available to help them. So you want to be sure that they're in a safe place and that they have resources available to cover any emergencies, or they have friends nearby, or some, type of support that allows them to live safely in the community. And, obviously you're part of that plan. And obviously, you're going to be involved in it, and you're going to be available at least somewhat once the person moves. But, these are all the things you need to assess. So lots of things going on there. We're on slide 19. If a person is going to move in with a roommate, then that kind of complicates things even further, right? So you definitely want to know that the two people get along, or three people, or, if there's a group, that everyone gets along, and we all have challenges as life goes on. It doesn't mean it's always going to be, happy and smiley. We all have challenges, but, you want to make sure, at least in the first instance, that you have people who can get along and have similar goals and, lifestyles or whatever, just so that everyone is comfortable. During the planning process, you also need to identify if any environmental modifications are needed. For example, if a person has trouble walking, do they need a ramp? Do they need a lift of some kind? If it's 2 stories, do they need a chair lift to move to the second floor? Do they need grab bars in the bathrooms? Things along those lines should be considered as you're developing the larger plan, so that it's not a surprise after the fact. In some instances, you might be able to find an apartment, for example, you can take a second floor apartment because there's an elevator in the building. And that's not an issue because you were able to locate something that met that requirement. But you may also be looking at, an apartment that has 2 steps to get into it, and that might require, a small ramp to be built. And there's a process for obtaining funding and also obtaining sign off from the landlord, which is another piece. So, there are a lot of things that need to be looked at in advance and planned for. And you always want to make sure that you include things that help to keep a person safe at home, such as grab bars, or, if ambulation is an issue, that the floors don't have a lot of steps, different levels within the housing unit, things like that. Then comes the planning for supports and services. You need to look at how much support a person needs. Some folks might want someone to stop in a couple times a week to help them with groceries and meal planning. Other folks may need someone to stop in for a couple hours every day to help them get ready in the morning. So it really depends on what you're looking for. And you need to identify in advance what the needs are and how you're going to be able to find staffing to support that need. Or if you have natural supports, such as family who lives nearby or friends who live nearby who are willing to stop in every day, that's something that might be available as well. But that really needs to be planned for and identified ahead of time. Again, roommates, we can also go back to the live-in caregiver option, or a paid neighbor option, for someone who lives nearby. So there are different items available, different types of services, different types of supports that are available, but they're things that need to be planned for to make sure that that any change in housing is smooth and that folks are supported where they need to be. Obviously, finances are part of the whole discussion. You need to come up with some type of budget, even if you're only seeking a housing subsidy. You need to make sure that the rent is realistic, that the person understands that they're paying part of the rent if there's an OPWDD housing subsidy involved. Any other costs that might be involved, you need to make sure that a person has enough funds to also pay for their utilities so that their utilities aren't disconnected after the 3rd month. That they have money to put food on the table, that they have money to do additional activities. So budgeting is very important, like it is for people without developmental disabilities. You need to know you have enough money and resources to keep yourself healthy and safe, and that you can, do things outside. So, you really just need to have that plan set up in the budgeting. Self-direction for folks who are doing that, it's a much more complicated budget because you're also paying for services through the budget. But, you do have people helping you through that program. So there are a lot of different options, but you really need to go through these broad steps to make sure that everything is okay. Because the last thing you want to do is have someone move and then have it be a situation where they can't afford to put food on their table. So, you definitely want to be looking at all these things.
이런 상황이 되는 것을 발견하는 것을 원하지 않기 때문입니다.
We are on slide 20.
우리 20번 슬라이드 보겠습니다. 또 다른 것도 우리가 조금 전에 얘기했던 것도 있지만 자연적 관계망, 가족이나
支持。这个我经常要讲的一点就是，
be moving so that they can get away from their family. I always joke about this. I tell a story. I have lived alone for a while, and my mother happened to work near where I live, and she had a key to my house. So there would be mornings that I would get up and my mother would be sitting in my dining room. So, that had to be corrected because it was a little challenging and a little disconcerting to come downstairs and find my mother sitting in my dining room when she didn't live with me. So it is a conversation. It is not a comfortable conversation, but it is something that families need to be aware of as well. Your adult child might want to move a little bit further away from you than you would prefer to have them move. So that is part of the conversation that needs to happen as well. You may want to be there as their parent every morning and every evening to help them get ready for whatever. And, your loved one may have a different view. They may want you in the morning, but not in the evening, because maybe their friends are, they want to spend time with their friends in the evening, things like that. When you're developing paid supports, sometimes the family can provide a lot of supports, and you just want staff to come in when, a couple days a week so that the family has a break. That's something that is available as well, but you always want to have backup plans for any situation. If you're a parent and you're a single parent and you're going every day to help your child with their get ready for their day and be ready and make sure that they have food and, whatever you help to support with, make sure that their clothes are clean and, they're wearing appropriate clothing for the weather. And then, you catch a really bad cold and you can't leave the house for 4 days. Who's going to help with that if you're the primary caregiver? If you've developed a staffing plan, you probably want to be sure that there's a backup staff in case that happens. Or if you have a staffing plan where a ComHab worker comes in every day, what happens if the ComHab worker calls in sick? You need to have the backup plan. Sometimes it's you're paying for staff and your backup plan is the family can stop over when there's an emergency that comes up. But there's a lot of planning to be sure everything is safe, but there's a lot of options as well. So, part of the purpose today is just to raise awareness of things to consider, because sometimes we don't always think everything through and we think, okay, as long as we have a housing subsidy, we're good. But there are a lot of other pieces that are moving and that you need to keep in mind as you're planning. And obviously we talked about budgeting. So, that's very individual specific. So, but do be aware, a good budget is always helpful. We are on slide 21. Obviously, the most important concern is to be sure that people are safe when they're living in the community. And, you want to set up supports to help them be independent and to make sure that they're safe. But one of the other things that you do need to talk to your loved one about is what the risks are in different parts of their life, and make sure that there are supports in place, some type of mitigation. you know, how often can a person be alone? You know, can they be alone for 5 or 6 hours without someone checking in? You know, is there, you know, do they have a choking hazard? Things like that. So you just want to assess and make sure that everything is looked at, just to make sure that, you know, you've mitigated any issues that happen that might be in place. There is a strengths and risk inventory tool that is available on the OPWDD website. There is a link for that in the resources document that we've shared. So you can click on that and it will take you to the OPWDD website. And it will walk you through a lot of the concerns and considerations and kind of how to mitigate them and things to look at. So that's a very helpful tool for folks to use during the planning process, but specifically to identify risk and to give options on how to mitigate that risk. Okay, when someone has decided that they're going to make a housing change, through the OPWDD service system and through general availability of services, you know, across the country and in New York State specifically, there are people to help through this process. The first person in OPWDD's line of supports for folks, again, is the care manager and the care coordination organization. Their role is to help develop the person's life plan and to identify, you know, what they're looking for and help them get that. So we have asked the care managers to help people find housing, to help people with the process of applying for housing subsidies and any other supports. If you need services approved in order to be able to move, you know, they'll help with that as well. If you don't have a care manager, the regional office staff can help, specifically the front door staff, help with approving services for folks. So that staff is also available. If your loved one is receiving ComHab, if it's part of their plan, very often the ComHab staff can help. You know, if part of the person's plan is to find housing, and that's part of their life plan and their ComHab staff plan, they can help with that. You know, maybe they can take people out to look at apartments, you know, when they're together, different things like that, or just talk about what they're looking for and maybe help research online, things along those lines. So there are a number of paid staff in our service system who can assist. If a person is self-directing, their support broker can help. They can help with, you know, identifying housing, working through the whole process of ensuring that, you know, risks are assessed and general planning. They also will help with the budgeting. And, you know, that's always a really good option if someone is self-directing, because you do have additional folks to help you. It's a little bit more complicated, but there are additional people to help through the process. Some providers offer something called housing navigation services. That may or may not be widely available depending on where you live, but it is an option as well. And some brokers and also FIs are certified housing navigators, and they can help with this process. You know, so that's something to look for as well. Then the more general availability of folks to help are HUD-approved housing counseling agencies. Housing counseling is a good option, specifically if you're hoping to purchase a home, because they can help through that process. But also they can help with things like improving your credit, to help get better apartments, because sometimes, you know, a person's credit score is checked by landlords before they're allowed to move into a home. So that housing counseling agencies can help with various activities to improve credit, to build credit. You know, if you're looking, you know, they can help with budgeting in terms of planning for moving into an apartment, if you're moving into an apartment first. So there are other resources besides those funded through OPWDD for folks to tap into, and that's not, and the HUD specific activities, those are for anyone in the United States. That is a service that our federal government pays for and is a good option for folks. So, you know, even if your loved one is not eligible for OPWDD services, or you're here today to just hear some information about housing, HUD is a good option for folks. And especially if as a family, you're looking to buy a house, again, may or may not be fundable through OPWDD housing subsidy. But even if you're looking as parents with small children to purchase a condo or a townhouse or an apartment or even a full home, again, I understand downstate it's kind of expensive, but HUD trains people as housing counselors who can walk you through the process and can help you with strategies to improve your chances of finding housing. And that's completely across the board. That's not just specific to OPWDD. Again, you know, I've said it many times, planning is important. It's the most important thing. Start early, give plenty of time for the planning process, help the person to learn about living independently and help them to understand what to expect. You know, if they're living with mom and they're going to live independently, remind them, you know, get them used to the idea that mom isn't necessarily going to be there every day to cook meals. So maybe they need to learn how to cook meals, or at least, you know, buy ready-made meals that they can microwave, you know, whatever the situation is. You know, planning, you need to look at what a person is receiving currently and figure out what they need in the future and start the process for getting those approved. And obviously identifying where to live and who they're going to live with. So, you know, it is a long process. And the sooner you start, very often the smoother the process is, because as we all know, if you have to do something as an emergency, it's, you know, it's much more stressful, much more complex, and the outcomes for anyone who's doing things under any type of emergency are much more challenging. So, you know, certainly you want to take your time and work through the whole process. Okay, we are now on slide 24. OPWDD does have a housing subsidy program. There are some very specific rules around the program that need to be followed. So we're just going to touch on the high level. The document itself is available on the OPWDD website, and you can read through it. Again, the resources that I commented on earlier, care management, housing subsidy agencies, regional office staff can help you with this particular process. But the information is available on the OPWDD website, and over 6,000 people are currently accessing the OPWDD housing subsidy at this exact moment in time. So obviously, it's something that a lot of people are tapping into. It's helping people to live independently, and it is available. And obviously, with any type of funding, there are rules that apply. So we're going to talk a little bit about the rules as we move through the next few slides. So we are on slide 25. The OPWDD housing subsidy program is funded with 100% state dollars, which means that we're not receiving federal funding or anything else, any other type of funding for the housing subsidy itself. It's designed to support someone who is income eligible. So there is a calculation in place, and we do occasionally have people who make enough money that they're not eligible for the OPWDD housing subsidy. So there is a calculation in place. Additionally, we only fund non-certified settings. So the funding is available for someone who is choosing to live out in their community in a non-certified setting. They need to be financially and legally responsible for the housing unit as a responsible tenant. Most of the time, that will mean that the person is a leaseholder for an apartment. It may also mean that they're on, if the housing unit is owned, I know apartments and co-ops are often apartments. the person can be on the deed or the mortgage to that particular unit, and that would demonstrate responsibility for the unit. But we are looking for legal tenancy rights for the person on the unit as well. The person needs to contribute approximately 30% of their countable income towards housing costs. And housing costs are rent or mortgage, it's utility costs, it may be insurance if you have homeowners or renters insurance, things along those lines. And the person's income can be their benefits, it might be SSI, SSDI, I'm sorry, Social Security, Social Security disability insurance. It may be actual income, it may be unemployment. If someone had a job and then they were laid off and they're eligible for unemployment, things along those lines. And there's a calculation that's done, and typically a person will need to contribute 30% of their countable income towards their housing costs. The 30% number is the number that HUD, Housing and Urban Development, that's the federal government that manages the Section 8 program. 30% is what HUD considers affordable for any type of housing. So regardless if you're making a lot of money or a little bit of money, HUD considers your housing affordable if you only have to pay no more than 30% of your income. So when you have housing subsidies, that's typically the percentage that you will see that the person contributes to their rent, and then the subsidy covers the remaining amount up to a certain amount. And that's true for HUD, it's true for OPWDD, it's true for a number of other state-funded housing subsidy programs that are available to other populations. So, that's HUD established that number as affordability, and pretty much everyone else mimics that number. Okay. We are on slide 26. In the first instance, when someone is looking for a housing subsidy, they should actually reach out to their care manager, I should say, should actually reach out to OPWDD with an application. We have started a preliminary approval process. From the planning process that we were talking about earlier, that's an important step as well, because what will happen is the care manager will submit a bunch of information to OPWDD about how much the person makes, what their benefits are, if they're receiving SSI, if they have a job, what that whole financial situation is for the person, and where they hope to live. And OPWDD will do an assessment to make sure they meet the criteria. And if they do, then they'll issue an initial support letter. So then a person will know this is the maximum rent that we're looking at if I want to live in this county. So a lot of information happens as exchanged in that first round, so that it helps as part of the planning process. So it's important as part of that whole, kind of path to living independently, that you reach out to OPWDD through your care manager typically, to get information about whether or not you appear to be eligible for the subsidy, and approximately how much rent you would be eligible for, so that you know how to plan when you're looking for housing. So that is an important first step. The maximum amount a person will be eligible for is determined by the number of bedrooms, number of people living together, and the county where it's located. So it's important to kind of have a general idea what you're looking for, and then we can provide accurate information to you. Okay, we are on slide 28, I believe. No. Oh, I jumped ahead. Slide 27, we're on. I apologize. To be eligible for a housing subsidy, the person has to meet certain criteria. As I mentioned, any kind of funding that you receive from the government of any type typically has rules, and now we're going to talk a little bit about those rules. First of all, in order to access an OPWDD housing subsidy, the person has to be OPWDD eligible. Many of you are familiar with that process. You go through it to identify whether or not a person meets eligibility under mental hygiene law. Typically, that is done prior to the age of 8, although sometimes it happens afterwards. Typically to be eligible, a person needs to have an identified developmental disability that is expected to be ongoing and occurs prior to the age of 22. So very often folks moving through the school system will be identified as meeting that criteria. So that is a requirement, obviously, because the funding that is allocated to OPWDD is allocated to support people with developmental disabilities. So the person needs to go through the process of being eligible for the OPWDD services. Additionally, in order to receive a housing subsidy, the person must be at least 18 years old. And the reason for that is they need to be legally able to sign documents. As I mentioned earlier, the person needs to have tenancy rights, legal rights, and responsibilities for the housing unit. So they need to be able to sign documents committing themselves to responsibility for the housing unit. Therefore, they have to be at least 18 years old. They also need to either have or will have appropriate supports and services and safeguards in place to meet their needs in the community living independently, and it has to be documented in their life plan. So again, this is part of the larger planning process. Someone may not have the services already set up. For example, if someone is living with their parents and they're receiving ComHab 2 hours a day because their parents are around, but if they live on their own and they need additional ComHab services, say in the evening, then that would need to be in the planning process. It will need to be identified. The care manager needs to know that they're working on getting additional ComHab hours for a person so that they can live in the community. And then you also need to be able to live independently without receiving support services that exceed an authorized service amount. It's a little bit technical, but very often you're looking at, someone self-directing and they need to be able to support their needs through their self-direction budget. That's usually where you're seeing this type of challenge, is just, do you have enough money to cover the level of staffing that you need to be able to ensure that you can live independently in the community? Okay. Expectations continued. We do require that the housing unit itself meet certain criteria as well. First of all, the unit must be a separate dwelling unit that could be rented independently to anyone in the community. Specifically, it cannot be a room rental. I touched on that earlier. You can't rent a room from your family member. You can't be in a boarding house. You can't, those types of arrangements we don't support. The housing unit has to be integrated in the community. It can't be institutional or isolating for the person. If a person can't drive and they're living, they want to live out in the country where there's no public transportation and they're 2 miles from any services or grocery stores or anything like that, that might create an isolating situation for the person. So that is something that we're going to look at as well, just to make sure that a person is able to access what they need from the community. So we're looking at isolating type settings. Really, we just want to be sure that people have the opportunity to live and be fully integrated within their community setting. We do have something called the QA expectations checklist. That stands for Quality Assurance Expectations Checklist. And basically it's several pages of things like, does the toilet flush? Is there a kitchen? Can the person cook? Is the person able to cook, I should say. So is there a stove? Is there microwaves are not required. Is there a stove? Is there a refrigerator so that their food can be kept safe? Are there windows? Different things like that. Is there a way for a person to get out if there's a fire? Are there fire smoke detectors, fire alarms, things like that. So it's fairly straightforward what we're looking for. And you can take a look at the QA expectations checklist, which is also posted on our website as part of the housing subsidy. But any housing unit needs to meet any of those criteria as well. Additionally, the housing unit needs to have no more than 4 unrelated adults living together or fewer if limited by local code. Sometimes you see, a big house somewhere where they're all, there's a lot of rooms in the house. So people get together and they rent a house together and, there's 7 or 8 people living together. That is not an arrangement that we would typically fund. So that's something to be aware of as well, because, every once in a while, someone will think this is a great idea. Why don't we do this? And on first instance, it seems like it might be a good idea. And perhaps that is, how people want to live and, they want to be with a group of their friends, and that is fine. But that is not typically something OPWDD would support. And you need to be aware as well in those types of arrangements, sometimes local municipalities have more requirements, more restrictive requirements. Like they may say that no more than 3 unrelated adults can live together or things like that. So it's something to be aware of. Again, we can answer your questions here at OPWDD. Your care manager can reach out on behalf to figure out whether or not something would be approvable. Just to ask for general information. It's easier to ask ahead of time than to get through the whole process and sign a lease and then find out that it can't be funded through OPWDD and now you're in this weird situation. So everyone should just be aware that we do expect not only does the person need to meet certain criteria, but the housing unit itself also needs to meet certain criteria. Okay, we are now on slide 29. Occasionally something may change in a person's situation or life where their budget changes once they're living independently. This can include a situation where maybe they have a job or they're, get a second job or, for the first time get a job and now they're making some money. It may be that the person has a significant other that moves in with them. Maybe their roommate that they originally moved in with leaves and now they're living alone. There's a lot of different instances under which a person's housing arrangement changes and therefore their budget arrangement changes. In those situations, it has to be reported to the regional field office in a timely manner. So we expect folks to let their care manager know or their housing subsidy provider know, my roommate Alex has moved out. Now I'm living alone. So we need to reassess how much money I need to be paying or that OPWDD will pay on my behalf to make sure that I have housing available to me and, don't end up not paying my rent and get evicted or whatever the situation is. So over time, there is a process for amending a budget, maybe after a year, the lease is being renewed and the rent goes up. Obviously, you're going to want to tell OPWDD that your rent is going up and, we'll do a reassessment. And if it's still within the maximum rent level under the subsidy, we would increase the amount that we're paying to the landlord. So everyone just needs to be aware that if situations change, that you need to have that reassessment done as well. I already touched on occupants moving in and out. If the person is no longer living in the housing unit, then we need to know that as well. Every once in a while, we do have someone who gets
경우에
arrested.
따라서 만약 사람이 arrest 된다든지 또 거기 아파트에서 혼자 살고 싶지 않고 다시 가족들과 함께 살고 한다든지 그런 일이 있을 때 우리가 알아서 그거 역시도 저희가 계속 폐할 건지 말 건지 우리가 또 결정을 합니다. 어떤 경우는 혼자 아파트에 오래 살다가 이제는 굉장히 혼자 독립적으로 사는 게 너무 힘들어서 이제 시간이 지나서 우리가 좀 더 도움을 받을 수 있는 뭐 너싱홈을 들어간다든지 OPWDD 그룹홈으로 들어간다든지 인증주거상으로 주택으로 들어간다든지 하는 경우가 됐습니다. 그래서 그럴 때는 그 체인지가 필요할 때 그 체인지를 할 수 있습니다. 어떤 경우는
or if they're self-directing and, maybe they have a small housing subsidy, a couple $100s a month or something, they may decide that they want to use that money instead for services through their self-direction plan. And they may want to contribute more money out of their actual income or resources to pay for that. That's allowed as well. We just ask that in those situations, in a timely manner, the care manager or the housing subsidy provider reaches out to the regional office so we can reassess the situation and so that everything is done in a fairly timely manner. The final piece of the OPWDD housing subsidy that we're going to talk about today is the transition stipends that are available in certain circumstances. OPWDD does have funding available typically for the costs of setting up your first apartment or your first housing unit. And these are typically a once in a lifetime payment that's available. And there are other rules around it, as there always are, but high level, the first funding opportunity that is available for someone who is moving out of a certified setting, if they're in a group home and they're moving into the community, there is a program called Community Transition Services, and that is a Medicaid waiver service. It allows for up to $5,000 in setup expenses when a person is moving out of a certified setting. This is to cover the setup costs of a housing unit. It can be furnishings, it can be pots and pans, it can be linens, towels, sheets, bed sheets. The security deposit is also within that $5,000 limit. So it is really designed to help people move out of an institutional setting, because very often folks moving out of a certified setting, not necessarily institutional, but a certified setting, folks moving out of a certified setting typically don't have a lot of housing items, because very often it's a group home and they may just have a favorite chair or something that they have in their group home. So there's a little bit more funding available if you're moving out of a group home. And again, that is covered through the Medicaid waiver. Then what most people access is the OPWDD housing subsidy transition stipend. And that is, again, paid for by the state and not by the federal government. So the setup expenses are limited to $3,000, again, to cover expenses to set up an apartment or a house. And on top of that, a one-time security deposit up to the amount of rent that they're eligible for. So that is available as well. Again, it is a once in a lifetime stipend, but it is available for many, many people who are moving into their own apartment for the first time. The expenses on these particular, both of these transition stipends need to be incurred within 90 days before or after the date that you move. So typically that will be the first day of your lease. So, if you're planning to move in September and you know where you're moving and you have your lease set up to move on September 1st, you could be buying, linens and towels and things now, and that cost would be allowable under the transition stipend. But again, the whole planning process, you would know if that money was available to you or not, because the regional office would just check and make sure you need to receive an ongoing housing subsidy, so you need to be eligible for the housing subsidy. So there's a lot of assessment and approvals that need to take place, and that's why the planning process we discussed earlier is so important. Okay. I know I went through a lot today. It's a lot to take in. It's a lot of information. I'm sure many people have questions about what I've discussed today. We will accept questions. Generally speaking, the questions can come into housing initiatives, which is here at OPWDD. But I do know that Dr. Bay is interested in helping to facilitate the collection of questions and to support folks who are on this call today. So Dr. Bay, if you'd like to say a few words.
Great. Patricia, thank you so much for a very thorough presentation about the housing options today. I hear your voice is almost gone. You've been talking almost like 2 hours. So thank you so much. As we announced, this session is the first part of the OPWDD housing presentations. There will be a second part of a presentation on June 30. If you have not registered, please email your name to cida@cidainfo.com. We will send you a link to register. Today we have the more than 300 people registered. Many people probably not going to be able to make it today because their work and they have to pick up their children, but we like to make sure our information reach to everyone who are in our network. Lastly, we will send you an email, as Patricia mentioned, and also earlier in our presentation. Please look for email from CIDA, and also AFD and Project Ready may collect some information through their network. We will gather all
따로 또 정보를 받을 수 있겠지만 우리가
OPWDD. This way, we can have a very comprehensive answer from OPWDD. If you try to reach to OPWDD individually, it makes some time to get the answer because there are thousands of emails coming from entire New York State. So we ask you wait for our email, and you can send the email. You can actually send a question through email so we can organize. Sometimes we receive the same question from multiple families. So it'll be better we organize the questions in readable manner so OPWD can give us the very accurate answer that you want to hear. So thank you again for participating this very important presentation. Again, OPWDD STEP, and I can't really thank you enough for this collaboration, and also FD and Project Ready. We will have another meeting to make sure that all the families receive the housing information so we can achieve the independent living of our children. Thank you so much for participating this event, and you have a great weekend.
Thank you, and we'll see everyone in a couple weeks.